Okay.
Says we're live.
We're live. Hi, everyone. We are now on episode 3-ish of Door 3's Open Hours TV. I'm here with Alex Asianov, who's the president and founder of Door 3. And we are missing our usual correspondent, Jonathan Blessing, who's on vacation this week. So it'll just be Alex and I. We're free to say whatever we want.
About Jonathan.
In his absence. Hopefully he's not watching the live stream right now, but I guess if he is, he could always log in to Zoom and interrupt. Yeah. But our theme, we do genuinely hope that Jonathan's having a good time on vacation though. Our theme for this week is RFPs and some ideas about RFPs that we have known and loved and lost, and also thinking through like both sides of the RFP process. So we experience things from the agency side of responding to these RFPs, but maybe particularly in my role as a user experience designer, it's important to think through with empathy what the experience is like on the other side, on the initiator of the RFP process side, and sort of how to kind of arrange this process in a better way for better outcomes all around. I think everybody on our side, on the agency side, likes to complain about the RFP process. I've never met anybody in the consultancy world that's like, RFPs, I love them. Wish we responded to more of them. That's such a good way to get work. So sure, like foolproof and smooth sailing. But I think that there's ways that the process could, I'm sure there's complaints on the other side too. So we're going to talk about that and think through that a little bit.
Sounds good. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Ready to go.
So I don't know, Alex, I was hoping that maybe you had some examples of RFP processes that we've been through. I know that you and I worked on an RFP recently, just when I first started at Door 3, and I'm sure there's lots of RFPs in your history. So maybe you could tell us about some notable ones.
Sure. So I vividly remember an RFP we responded to. It was for a construction management firm, a sizable construction management firm, and they had a large committee that was evaluating the respondents to the RFP. So we made the short list as we usually do, and then came the process of presenting to the selection committee. And the interesting thing about that RFP, and this is a very, very common thing, especially in government institutions, but also RFP processes are often copied. Government processes are often copied by private organizations, and this was the case with this RFP. It was a blind RFP process, meaning you couldn't talk to anybody during the paper part of the process. You had your one presentation and then radio silence before and radio silence after, right? Mm-hmm. So we went through this process, didn't meet any of the stakeholders except the procurement officer, received the RFP, responded to the RFP, were shortlisted, scheduled in for a meeting, met with a team whose background we didn't even know who was going to be there, right? And delivered our presentation, and we didn't get the work, right? Even though our presentation was comprehensive and really covered a lot of the bases that I think we're going to review later in this conversation about what really should be what a client should know about a potential partner, right? So why didn't we win the work, right? So they were kind enough to not have radio silence after we lost
Mm-hmm.
the RFP, right? And I do want to point out that what I say today is not going to be from the perspective of like, oh well, you know, what's good or bad for the the agency, right, or the consulting firm. That's not what's interesting. What's interesting is what's good or bad for the client, the potential consumer of these services. So what happened in this case? What happened in this case is that there was, we presented a solution that had a certain element of their internal infrastructure being retired after about, you know, a year, some development, a couple of phases, and then there was an element that was going to be retired. That element was clearly identified in the RFP as a problematic part of their infrastructure, of their software infrastructure. But the retirement of that element was not a mandate for the project. Turned out that one of the IT managers who was in the selection committee was like, that person's sole responsibility was that application, right? And if that application wasn't there, that person felt like their job was going to be threatened. The absence of that application would have been a boon to that company, right? Reduce cost of ownership, you know, reduce manual processes, you know, reduce burden of legacy code and you know, hiccups and downtime and all these other things. But this person was on a mission to preserve their job, right? So they found lots and lots of ways to express their dissatisfaction with our presentation that did not have to do with the fact, right? But in the retrospective with the procurement officer, it became very clear to both of us what actually happened, right? And so how could this have been prevented, right? It could have been prevented through a less blind process with no radio silence. If they had run the RFP in such a way that you know, we would have had a chance, not just us, every vendor would have had a chance to meet if they wanted to with the individual members of the selection committee, learn about their priorities, understand their fears, uncertainties, and doubts, as well as aspirations, right? And you could balance those things and even speak to those things fairly carefully, but effectively in the room with the committee, so that there is a sense of mutual purpose. There is a shared purpose that everyone can buy into, that's developed in the room, and that's what you want to learn. You want to learn if your team and the partner vendor team can create that joint sense of purpose and that direction. Not whether they can do .NET development, because everybody can do .NET development, right? Or whatever technical thing, right? Like, that's just the lowest bar you can have. And unfortunately, with RFPs that are blind, you know, you shortlist people who cross the lowest bar and oftentimes fail to evaluate the real bar for actual project success, right? So that brings me to a question of like, so if the RFPs are so bad, well, hold on, they're not all bad, right? So that's a bad aspect of a blind RFP. So, you know, like, you know, that joke, like you go to a doctor's office and you say, hey doc, it hurts when I do this. And the doc says, well, don't do that, right? That's the same thing with RFPs. There are certain specific things that don't work well, that work against the interest of the client, right? So just don't do them. So the question is, what are those things? Don't run a radio silent RFP. Run an engagement, because you, in the end, you're interviewing for an engagement. So run an engagement to see how it goes, right? So
right.
That's
I mean, I think it's like really frustrating on our side to feel that you've invested a bunch of time and effort into an endeavor that doesn't go anywhere. And that's going to be true no matter what, right? But what's really frustrating is not so much that you spent the time and then you didn't get the work. It's that you spent the time and it turns out that you were barking up the wrong tree the whole time, because there's some important aspect that the client never revealed in the RFP that was integral to their requirements, and you just didn't know about it. So this whole time you're talking about how great you're going to be at developing a new application or moving all of their storage to a cloud solution out of some like server closet that they keep on site. And it turns out that was never on the table. That was never a possibility. And the fact that you mentioned it actually took you out of the running. So it would have been helpful to know that. And then you could have either said, I don't think that this is a good idea for you, client, honestly speaking, or you could have said, you know, sure, we can do it your way. And we're not going to waste time, like, developing this elaborate scheme that you're never going to accept because it wasn't on the table.
Yeah, I mean, what's frustrating to me is, yes, it's frustrating to us, but it's also it's frustrating that we didn't get a chance to address something, or we're barking up the wrong tree. What's most frustrating to me is when I see that the client's interests wind up being underserved by the results of the RFP, right? And we participated in that process, and somehow we're unable to even mitigate that, right? Because that's the process is disempowering to the vendor, to some degree reasonably so, and to some degree unreasonably so, right? And so when we see a problem, we can't, that whole thing, see something, say something. We can see something, we can't say something, and that's I think the radio silence is a mistake. I understand that in the case of government RFPs, there is a sense of there is a requirement to comply with rules of fairness and ensure that there isn't an opportunity for cronyism. And so radio silent RFPs were sort of created by the government partly to support that ethos. But in the end, just remember that you actually do want to create favoritism. You want to go from having non-favored vendors to having a favored vendor. That is literally the purpose of the RFP process. So it is not unreasonable or unfair that if you give the same opportunities to all the vendors to have engaged, interesting conversations with your stakeholders, if someone doesn't take advantage of that, that is not unfair to them. That is very fair. It's a very clear clue that they're not interested in engagement, right? Enough to compete with companies who are interested in engagement. If the engagements do occur, if the conversations in the RFP process actually happen in a non-blind RFP, and some of the conversations are better than others, that's not cronyism. That means that the conversations are more constructive with one vendor than with another. That means the partnership is potentially better with one vendor than another between their staff and your staff. And those are the real keys to project success. That's what should be developing a client's sense of favorite when it comes to who the preferred vendor should be. That's not cronyism. That's not favoritism. That is fair selection based on crucial success criteria for projects. So, so like I said, don't run a blind RFP. Engage people as much as possible. Also, I do want to talk a little bit about the dimensions of evaluation, right? So I already harped probably long enough on the relationship dimension, but there are other dimensions that are rarely explored in RFPs that are just as important as whether someone does .NET or Java well enough to meet your standards and deal with the complexity of your application. One of those is kind of the commercial health of the organization. Another is process maturity. Those two dimensions are rarely evaluated. So when you the commercial health of an organization, the evaluation often stops at asking, how many people do you have? How many, how many developers, how many project managers, and you get a sense of scale, but that doesn't tell you whether the company is barely making it and is going to be around to even finish your project, right? So I think looking at the longevity of the organization, its scale, those are valid things, but also asking about the concentration of work. So you want to make sure that you're not hooking up with a vendor who gets 95% of their income from one company. That company could go away as a client tomorrow, and now you're left paying their rent, or they have to go away, right, and not finish your project. So your costs on the project could skyrocket simply because an event like that occurred. When it comes, so you want to explore the financial health without being too intrusive. You can't get into someone's pocket. You can't ask an agency reasonably to divulge their detailed financials. You can, but it's usually not done because it's just the bad relationship management. Unless you reciprocate, it's a challenging question to ask. But asking tangential questions about their revenue concentration is completely reasonable. They're spread across industries, across clients, across disciplines. Like, for example, if you're asking them to do a project in React, how many other projects are they doing in React? And are you going to be their only one? Because if they're using their entire React developer pool to serve you, right, that means they're probably going to be motivated in an unhealthy way to retain React work with you even when you don't need it, right? They may not have other React developers when you need a spike, right? There are all sorts of other structural things that are worth exploring in polite ways.
But if we're going to talk about budget, maybe we should talk about the lack of budget that's usually expressed in RFPs. So this makes the RFP process really hard. And I think, clients quite rightly think, hey, this process is supposed to be sort of open-ended, and we want to see how agencies are going to respond to the sort of problem statement that we're presenting here. And we want to see, how well they think they can solve it for X amount of, and how much they think that's going to cost. So often there won't be a budget at all. And then you're sort of flying blind in terms of what is even possible. You may, because of course there's a budget. It's not like there's literally no budget. Of course there's some ceiling to the amount of money that an organization can spend on whatever it is that they're trying to do. And somebody has a number in mind. It's not like that, they're like, just tell us whatever. And we'll just pick the best one. And like, the number isn't a concern. So yeah, I think that you don't want to be scaling your solution to the amount that is being offered necessarily, but you also don't want to be, trying to blindly compete for the lowest possible number with the assumption that, hey, they're just going to pick whatever's cheapest that says they can do what they need, because the likelihood that the cheapest vendor is actually going to be able to solve your problems the best way is probably pretty slim. Yeah. But
so like I sometimes the cheapest vendor can solve your problem, right? But maybe with a lot of risk, right? So that whole risk reward equation is a little tricky, and I think it's more nuanced than most people think who are not doing software development for a living. And so I agree with you that lack of budget is a huge problem in RFPs. I believe the clients think that they are getting better information this way, but in reality, when you think of like developing anything, building a house, right? You can build a house that can house 5 people comfortably, right? Out of brick, or you can build it out of plywood and 2x4s and like the kind of house that I live in, right? Because in Florida they don't build much out of brick, right? Both kinds of houses tend to they can house the same number of people. There may be, but they represent different values. Right. It turns out that I didn't know this, but brick houses are not particularly storm resistant, whereas like wooden houses have a better storm resistance capability than brick houses. Who knew? So when you express a budget, right, you're basically creating a constraint against which someone can intelligently consider what it is that you really need. Just like you say, I need features A, B, C, D, and E. The budget is another value, right? And a lot of times you can get A, B, C, D, and E, but built in a slightly different way, right? or approaching the project from a slightly different sort of build buy or component perspective than you would if you had a different budget, right? And the way you evaluate whether a vendor is just sort of like cozying up to you by giving you the number you want versus doing this a solid job of estimation and thinking through this stuff is to look at everything else other than the number that they gave you, right? So look at the process that they're bringing to the table. Look at the estimation that they did, the detail, the questions they asked for the estimation process. So, if they're asking, fairly detailed, intelligent questions that challenge you, they're probably thinking real hard about how to meet your budgetary expectations while delivering maximum value.
Mm-hmm.
If they're asking you, basic questions that do none of those things, then it's a little bit suspicious. Just because your budget is $500,000 and someone gave you $499 and $499,999 doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that they found that they just slid under the number by compressing things as much as possible. And then you should challenge them to say, what compromises did you make? What did you have to do to get to that number, right? Because it's not and if the answer is, well, you told us that that's what the budget is, so we're just going to work real hard, that's never going to happen, because work real hard only gets you so far. You have to have realistic estimates, because people can't work 22 hours a day consistently across a project and be productive, right? So magic time doesn't exist, magic work doesn't exist. It all has to be rational and reasonable, and they have to be able to explain that to you.
Yeah, this is like my kitchen renovation metaphor, where I'm on the client side now, where I don't have full information about these processes. I don't know really what a good vendor for any of these services that I'm asking for. Like, I don't know the difference between a good plumber and a bad plumber by any metric, really, except that stuff doesn't spew water everywhere, right? But I won't know that until later. So I have no method for evaluating these vendors other than how comfortable they make me feel. And I'm asking for numbers because I, need to make some kind of comparison, but I don't really have a sense of what's reasonable and what's unreasonable, given the very specific particularities of, a 100-year-old house and the city and permits and all of these things. So I sort of have to just make my assessment on based on a vibe. I'm like, what sort of vibe am I getting from this person? Do they seem reasonable? Am I going to be really annoyed if they're in my torn up kitchen for weeks at a time? And I think that in the end, I have a budget that I do have a number in mind. I do have there's a cap, right? But I can't, there's no way for me to make an evaluation that's precise, because I don't have full information.
That's the thing, right? And think kitchen renovation is complicated. With all due respect to the people who are doing it, software development is a little more complicated, right? And so think about the position our clients are in, right? Trying to evaluate us, it's pretty horrible, actually, right? They have to try to do the best that they can to leverage their business acumen to understand the quality, capability, honesty, and probability of success of a project being done by a vendor who's doing things that are well beyond. It's like me trying to evaluate heart surgeons. I mean, in the end, it's based on how do I feel about them, right? Mm-hmm. And so the relationship is so important, and the RFP process so often short circuits that relationship. I want to bring up a kind of a small pet peeve of mine. Actually, it's a really big one, right? And that's one where the RFP process, or even processes that are not paper RFP, but selection processes where the actual decision maker is not part of the process, right? So they come in at the very end, listen to a committee, and then really, I have to be honest with all the listeners here, the only thing your stakeholder really hears most of the time is the number, right?
Mhm.
So as much as you may say as a committee, hey, we're evaluating the intelligence of the vendor, the quality of their solution, the viability of their company, the on and on and on and on. And even if all of our other people met with them and they built a great relationship, in the end, if the decision maker was never at the table until the very end, right, they're going to get some very confusing noise, right, that it's going to factor out as noise because they can't relive the experiences you guys had during the RFP process, the Q&A, the engagements with our staff. They're just hearing a recount of that, right? Which is like getting the cliff notes for all of Shakespeare. Like you only get so much out of that, and then a number, right? And so, and very often, what I've seen happen, what we've seen happen in those situations, is that something that they want got missed. Some budgetary number that they had in their head was exceeded, and we were never told what we never got a feel for it. We never built a relationship with them. They never understood that we're treating their budget as precious as our own pocket money, right? We're being very careful with it. All they see is that there's a number, and it's a sticker shock, right? And then they're like, well, there's this other vendor that has like 25% less budget. And great, like they may never deliver the project, right? But it's too late. The RFP process has already happened. It's decision time, and there's really not much you can do about it at that point, right?
Right.
So please bring the actual decision maker through the process with you. They need to meet the vendors. They need to develop relationships with the vendors, right? If they don't do that, you're running a very high risk of a breakdown downstream.
Where do you think they should come in? I mean, from the very beginning, or only when it's sort of been narrowed, the field has been narrowed to 2 or 3?
I think when the field has been narrowed, right? Like it's not fair to take a CIO, CFO, managing director of a division and put them through 15 vendors worth of relationship building. But when you have 2, 3, 4 companies that all seem reasonably capable of delivering. So the question is, are they really? Let's put a microscope on this. Let's see if the relationship is going to be right? Then let's build a relationship with the people with whom the relationship is going to have to be, because I guarantee you that senior stakeholder, while they say, yeah, I'm just going to sit back, I'm just going to write the checks, that is not the case. They're going to they're writing the checks, therefore they're going to want to know the status, they're going to want to care about the progress, the quality of the product that they now have their signature on, because they signed off on the budget, right? So the relationship has to be there to support all of that stuff. And it has to be there to support some potential hiccups, because a lot of software projects will experience some hiccups along the way. So the relationship better be there. Bring those people into the Q&A process so we can learn, we can ask some business questions of the business stakeholder, right? And then develop some one-on-one where that senior stakeholder and decision maker has an opportunity to meet not with the committee and 15 other people, but directly with the vendor, maybe with the account manager on the vendor side, or someone who's going to have an opportunity to really understand that person, really understand their needs, really understand their worries, so that the process can then begin to address those and have that person feel heard and understood.
Totally. Well, I think we should, maybe we should say the things that we think definitely need to be included in an RFP, and that'll be a good place for us to end this episode. I mean, what elements are you like, this has to be there, or we shouldn't even be looking at this thing?
You're asking me my criteria for, honestly, there needs to be Q&A, there needs to be an ability to go beyond the Q&A meeting and the final presentation to have some additional conversations. The senior stakeholders and decision makers have to be engaged. There has to be more than a rote technical questionnaire about whether or not we do .NET, React, Angular, or whatever, right? Like these are not good decision criteria. Everybody should be able to. Everybody who knows how to code Hello World should be able to pass those things, right? So So I think there has to be some depth to the process and to the questions and engagement by the client.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think including a budget is a good thing to to consider as well, at least a range or an upper limit.
Yeah, good point. Absolutely.
Well, maybe we can maybe we could present a ideal RFP when and if we ever see one.
Yeah. And perhaps we can do another session specifically on senior decision maker engagement. I think that's a really, really important thing, right? That deserves its own half hour.
Totally. Okay. So this has been episode 3 or 4 of D3 TV Open Hours, with just Alex and Liz this time. So this is Door 3 signing off. And if people want to get a hold of us, we're available at projects@door3.com. And yeah, that's about the shape of it for this week, I think.
Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe.
Smash the like button. Okay, thanks, Alex.
Take care.